of the recording's kicked in. The head of teaching and learning at the Mary Immaculate College in Limerick, Ireland. And today's talk is based around, I have got it here, so I'm just going to read off what I've got presented in front of me, is we've got it as finding a path forward, the creation of an AI use statement tool. So welcome, Catherine. I'll pass on to you and I'll just mute myself, but just give us a shout if you need any help.
That's great. And look, thank you guys so much for having me. Um, I, as Ben said, I'm the director of teaching and learning and the head of our unit that focuses on technical enhancement at the college. For anyone who doesn't know, Mary Immaculate College, we're a liberal arts college with our programs accredited through the University of Limerick. And we largely focus on education. So we train a lot of the teachers for the country and, of course, the arts. But we were put to us that we needed to address this generative AI issue. And one of the things that we have been trying to do is think about the communication piece and how we think about um, what is the uses of generative AI that are or are not appropriate. I just make sure, Ben, can you see my slides okay?
Yeah, they've gone through.
Perfect. So I'll just move this so that we're looking at the camera. Sorry, I have multiple screens. Um, so essentially, what this talk is about is our efforts to try and rethink and maybe move beyond the traffic light system to find something that would work better for our students and for our college and hopefully better for the sector. This is a project that's funded by the National Forum, who is overseen by the HEA. And so just accreditation and thanks for the funding to do this. But essentially, I think a lot of us would be familiar with the traffic light system and really the intention that was behind it. I have a little quote up there, but essentially, what it's saying is that, when the traffic light system was brought out, the goal was to get people to start a conversation about incorporating generative AI and how to be transparent in their use. And on the surface of it, I think that's a good idea. I think we do have to have conversations. And I do think we need to think about what is appropriate and an appropriate use. But when I looked at the traffic light system, I saw some immediate problems in it that, at least in our context. Um, and what that was is that it relies on academics and students in having a conversation and then everyone remembering what those key points of the conversation was, and not just for one module, but for multiple modules. And we have staff that have very varying opinions about what is okay and not okay, even within a single department. And so sometimes these are based in ideological reasons. Sometimes it's based in people's perspectives around what's appropriate for technology in the classroom or not. Um, but they can have a lot of different and varying points. We also felt that it wasn't really engaging with our learning objectives. So there was nothing about the red light traffic or the traffic system that was essentially connecting why or why not we're using AI in relation to what the learning outcomes were meant to be for a given module or a given program. And we felt like that connection needed to be there, because without that connection, it could start to feel really arbitrary for students in terms of, we can't use AI because this person doesn't ideologically agree with it, but this person does, so now we can use it. And what we were concerned about is that, um, would that create a sense of unfairness? So McCandle et al. Gives us an interesting quote about the idea of fairness and justice in the classroom. And they tell us that essentially fair instructors are those that are seen to be respectful, impartial, flexible, willing to admit mistakes, use appropriate content on exams, and most importantly, to establish clear and consistent expectations. I think there can be a tendency when you're teaching a module is that you see that as your own ecosystem, and it is, but it's also part of that bigger program ecosystem. And if you have one set of rules in one module and a different set of rules in another, and it's not perfectly clear why those rules vary, there can be a sense that there's not clear, consistent expectations, and that there can be a sense of a lack of fairness in that. And you might be wondering, why is fairness important? Well, what they found in their study is that when they looked at the connection between perceptions of fairness and students' propensity to cheat, was that there was this middle group called the trivial, what they labeled the trivial cheaters, and that their propensity to cheat increased if their sense of unfairness increased. And when you look at the numbers in their study, they looked at 609 students, and 36.45% fell into this trivial cheating category. That's a big percentage. And it really determines the weight of how much authentic engagement with your courses you're going to get, based on whether someone's sense of fairness is influencing whether they're going to approach the work um, honestly or not. And so for me, I felt, and my team felt, that we needed to have a statement that took away this sense of the arbitrary and input things that were clear and consistent, and that essentially would reduce the sense of unfairness. So we decided that we were going to develop a statement, and we were going to develop an AI bot to help us with it. And what this statement would need to do is that it would have to link AI use to the specific learning outcomes for a given module, that it would have to have specific context and guidance, and that it would need to be clearly communicated. Um, but we needed that statement not to massively increase our staff's workload, because, as with every institution, our academic staff are asked to do more and more and more, and they're very time poor. So we needed something that was going to be easy for them to use and not create a huge amount of burden. So we took a dual development approach. We decided that what we were going to do is we were going to develop a custom ChatGPT where staff could take existing materials that they already had, insert those materials, and get an output. And the materials we decided that would need to be inputted were the module descriptor, the assignment descriptor, and the learning outcomes for the module. And we wanted that information to be put into our generative AI bot, and we wanted it then to produce a statement for us, for students, that was specific to the module, that were rooted in the learning outcomes, that outlined what was appropriate generative AI use, how could students essentially make use of generative AI without using it to complete their learning outcomes. So giving a can do's and a list of things that they shouldn't do, because it would prevent them from being able to reach their learning outcomes. And the idea behind that is that if students have clear understanding and communication, and they have a sense of fairness, and they can see why or why not they can use generative AI in particular contexts, that might increase the sense of fairness, and you might get less trivial cheating. So paired with that, we did a literature review where we looked at chatbots, but specifically custom GPTs wherever scholarship existed, in the context of accessibility, chatbots as pedagogical tools, chatbots in professional learning tools, chatbots in higher education, ethics of using chatbots. And then we also looked at the technical prompt development for custom GPT chatbots, to see what kind of guidance or best practice set that we could find. We had some constraints for how we would develop out this bot, and within it, it was that it had to be within a closed system. We needed something where staff would feel confident that their teaching materials would be put into an environment that wasn't going to a third party, where they knew that it wasn't being saved or stored and it was kept within our own internal systems. We needed to have something where there is options for an accessible output. We wanted to make sure that there was data security for input, insofar as we know that with custom GPT, Bath et al. 2004 tells us that with the custom GPTs, you can get external attacks where someone might ask it information, um, maybe about how it was set up or what documents it's using, and those documents can be leaked. Um, but also it can, if any inputs have been being saved by staff, they can ask for those as kind of things we were worried about. Could those be leaked as well? So really being conscious of data security, though Tess et al. Focuses more on the leaking of what underpins the custom GPT. Then we wanted to make sure that it could be discipline specific, because we have, even though we're a liberal arts college and we might think of them having kind of a shared umbrella, each department really has its own specific needs and constraints, particularly in relation to generative AI. So we wanted that to be accounted for. And then we wanted to think about how the outputs would be made practical and accessible to students. So those were our constraints that we were working within. And of course, we had lots of trials and tribulations. Um, we had issues with input overload. We had people coming back to us and saying, our outputs coming back to us and being really good on saying what you can do with generative AI, but being really wonky about saying what you can't do with generative AI. We had concerns about how well it was picking up on discipline concerns. So, for example, you might put in a module that's math based, and it might come back with acceptable uses that would maybe be appropriate for someone doing theater arts. So, we had some difficulty there. And then, of course, we had difficulty around thinking about how was this actually adding to the literacy, what was being communicated to students in terms of what was good and what was not good. Because initially, what we were getting was really a chart coming out that said do's or don'ts, but not that fuller explanation of why not. Um, so, to give you a sense of the input overload, initially when I set out to design the chatbot, what I did is I created a document and I mapped AI use to Bloom's taxonomy and gave lots of examples of how it would take shape, but also I outlined how the bot could essentially um, instruct using Bloom's taxonomy around what AI use would be appropriate or not in a disciplinary context. I gave detailed descriptions about the process of production and interpretation for the bot, how they should go about understanding what's been put into them, and then how they should process that for their outputs. I gave plenty of case studies, examples, and I had things that are that should read do's and don'ts. I think there's been an autocorrect there. Apologies. I had a list of do's and don'ts. Um, and essentially, what I found is that it really struggled. I actually came over to to Ben and Rob and said it's not working. Have you guys had any trouble with this kind of thing? And we looked across different um, types of custom GPTs that you can make, and it was felt and recommended to me that maybe I was overloading it. And actually, I went back and the scholarship supported that. There is a paper by Kaber et al. And essentially, they were developing a custom GPT for the neurosurgical research. And what they found is that when they gave too much instruction, that it actually forgot aspects of what it was meant to do, and they had to pare it back. So I definitely overloaded my bot in my first efforts. I also found that the biggest issue around the cans and cannot is that because I had all the Bloom's taxonomy in, and I had a whole bunch of case studies, what I kept getting was that instead of giving really specific examples around different types of AI use that you could or couldn't use, instead there was a lot of repetition of the learning outcomes that were put in by the initial prompt. So rather than getting something that was more detailed and concrete, it was a don't use generative AI to do your critical thinking. There wasn't anything beyond that, and it was too surface level. And what I realized is that in my detailed process, my detailed document that I gave, I was assuming that the bot could do something that it can't do, which is critically think. It can predict, and it can do that really well, but I was asking it to make an extra leap that an academic could do, but the bot couldn't do. And so I had to really start to think about, um, was I asking it too much? Was I assuming too much of it? Did I need to have clearer, more defined requirements rather than a broad description and narrative about how it should perform? Um, I also put in, we were using Copilot, and I also put into it requests around making things accessible. And I found it really struggled to do that. And when I tried to make things accessible, in fact, it made documents that became even more difficult for staff and students to engage with. They became inaccessible. So I then went and took it out of the instructions and instead went to the bot directly. And after it had produced its output, said, could you modify this to make this more accessible? And it came back with a response to me about how I could modify it to make it more accessible. So, in some senses, I struggled with at least Copilot for making an immediate output that was immediately accessible for different types of learning needs. And we did find in our research looking around accessibility that while a lot of scholars are talking about the potential for these types of technologies to increase accessibility, there really isn't enough research to look and say how accessible are they to set up and how accessible are their actual outputs. So we definitely came up against that. So I eventually did what Rob and Ben advised me. I stripped it back. And instead, I had read a paper about the importance of having requirements. So I put in a lot of requirements for what I required the bot to do. And I removed a lot of the narration that was in it, and I took out all of my examples and instead said, okay, let's see what the bot can do when I just give these kind of clearer, I want you to do this. Can you please say this? Can you deal with these inputs in the following way? And this is an example of what I got out. It's across 3 slides, so apologies. And the idea with this would be that you could copy it into your student handbook, and then students would have it or put it up on, for example, I know you guys use Canvas, you could put it up on your Canvas page. So this was for a module called Psychology in Practice 1. And it comes out and it says the purpose of the reflective diary assessment in Psychology in Practice 1 is it to enable students to critically reflect on their full-time work placement experience with a particular focus on the employability skills they have developed, which they then list. This reflection should be grounded in recognized reflective frameworks and demonstrate how the placement has influenced their thinking about their future career paths. The assessment is directly aligned with the module's learning outcomes, which emphasize critical reflection, application of psychological learnings in real world settings, and evaluation of personal strengths and career interests. Because the assignment is designed to foster independent reflection and personal insight, the use of generative AI must not interfere with the student's ability to reach these learning objectives on their own. The development of reflective and evaluative skills is central to the module and cannot be outsourced to AI tools. And then it lists for the students what those specific learning outcomes are. And it says achieving these outcomes independently ensures that the students acquire the skills and knowledge necessary for success beyond college, particularly in professional environments where self awareness and critical thinking are essential. Students are reminded that any use of generative AI content in their assignments must be clearly cited. Where appropriate, AI use should be disclosed in a methodology or acknowledgement section, particularly if it has been used for generating ideas, summarization, or language refinement. Failure to do so may result in misrepresentation of authorship. All use of generative AI must be in line with the permitted AI use table provided in this module handbook. And then it produced essentially a table for me, which I asked it to do. And what it did is it looked at what the different tasks that were listed in the assessment brief were. And then it went through and did a list of permitted AI use and unpermitted AI use. And what you can see in this output is it's more specific. I don't just have them literally reiterating the learning outcomes. Instead, we have things like using AI to summarize different reflective models. It's pulled the names of the scholars that were referenced in the assignment brief. It has things like AI using AI to write diary entries or reflection is a not permitted use. So it's refining it down to really specific tasks or processes that the students might undergo. And then it says this recommended table provides aims to provide clear guidance on how generative AI can be used to support learning without compromising the integrity of the learning outcomes. By following these guidelines, students should be able to effectively use generative AI as a tool to enhance their learning experience while ensuring they meet the module's objectives. Through generative AI, though generative AI can be used to support students in their studies, students' scholarly judgment should be prioritized over AI outputs. So that's then what it created after a lot of juggling around. But we still had issues. So it wasn't perfect. I was really, really blessed that I had different academics who sent in, for example, that's based on a real module, and they sent in their module information, and we put in different examples to see. And what scholars were broadly coming back to me about was that essentially the outputs lack subject specific understanding. So, for example, in one of the education modules, they had given me an MA module, but what was the output that was pitched might have been appropriate for an undergraduate, but definitely not for an MA, where they would expect them to have better foundational research skills. So there was a need to consider the limitations. Sometimes it struggled to understand the overall intention of the module. And what we really found is that where modules were inputs were much more detailed, you got a more detailed response, where maybe learning outcomes or assignment briefs were less detailed, you you got a less detailed output. But sometimes it just would misinterpret, and that could happen. Sometimes it would create contradictory outputs. So it would say you can use generative AI to help you brainstorm, but you can't use generative AI to help you create ideas for your essay. So, uh, not perfect. Um, so what we found is that while it would create something, I'd say 80 to 85% there, it didn't produce perfect output. And in some senses, I got a reaction from staff where they were very disappointed and very much thinking that what should come out should be a perfect end product. And really, I don't think that's ever what we thought it would be, knowing what the limitations of the technology is. But what we did hope it would be, would it would give someone something that was nearly there that they could easily tweak and modify to their specific needs without having to write something from scratch or without it having to be so generic that it doesn't really apply to their module. Uh, and we also hope that it would stop and make staff think about, okay, one, where are my do's and don'ts for generative AI? And what learning outcomes do I actually want them to reach? Because sometimes when you would look at these outputs, you'd look and say, well, it's saying I can't do this particular thing with generative AI because it contravenes with the learning outcome. But actually, I don't really care if they use generative AI in that way. Maybe that learning outcome isn't as relevant now as what I thought it was. So we did hope that it would make people think about it and to think about where their bottom lines were and how were they going to clearly communicate that in a rooted way to students. And I came back to staff and asked the question of, um, would this be faster for you to use and slightly edit, then go back and do something from scratch, or have to use a really generic statement and then have to do additional supports on top of that? Uh, and there was silence on that front. But what staff did come back to me with was that they felt that they didn't really have a full understanding of the technology. So when the output came out, they weren't confident about saying, yes, the student can use it in this way, or no, they can't, because they felt that their AI literacy wasn't at a high enough level and that it was changing too quickly for them. And of course, we did have some staff that just simply came to us and said, I will never use it. I don't want my students to touch generative AI. So that's the bottom line for me. Um, so what we've realized some things going forward, and that's working with staff to identify the use and limitations is just so valuable. I think we probably are all already know that, but it is really valuable in terms of hearing on the ground. How would they use it? Would it be effective? Or is this just um, not what they need at this time? Thinking about how you can pair the bot with other resources. So, for example, we're launching a microsite that's going to be broadly on academic integrity, but have different sections on generative AI, specifically around literacy, data, and compliance, and approaches to assessing and giving grading and feedback on uh, work that might use generative AI. We're directing staff to an open course that's provided by our HEA on generative AI, and we're developing different policies and guidelines that will go alongside it. And the hope is that for some staff who aren't just directly opposed to it, that if they feel more confident in their understanding of it, will feel better placed to look at that table and say, yeah, that use is fine, or no, it's not. And we're really hoping that this bot will encourage discussion around AI use. We have found that in one of our departments, it has opened an immense amount of discussion. They've had multiple meetings. They've sent us through various emails, and we're getting to hear a lot of different voices. And I think that's actually really helpful for us as a college to navigate the space collectively and taking in account of discipline specific concerns. So we have different language departments, the Irish department, French and German, and looking at how well does this bot actually deal with those languages. So that's an area we're still exploring. But also mathematics proved an interesting module to put forth. Um, and initial iterations, again, as I said, sometimes recommendations might have been better for drama than for math, but we are starting to see some improvement around that when we took away requirements. But it is very important that if you have disciplines that are working outside of maybe arts and social sciences, for this we found having a more detailed description of what's putting in will give you better results. Um, and some tips for anyone if you decide you want to take on building a custom bot, although you can just speak to Ben and Rob because they have so much expertise in this, and they'd be well able to guide anyone. But I'd say consider the interface and how the outputs will be made accessible, because if you're asking staff or students to use an interface that isn't accessible, or where the output that they get isn't accessible, there needs to be consideration about how they will be made accessible, or what's the leveling ground for it. Um, Working with intended end users during the development phase is very helpful. It does help to redirect you maybe in areas that you weren't thinking or anticipating. For example, it hadn't occurred to me when I had put in for English that the MA, being able to have um, an awareness of level of expertise was going to be an important factor. Considering GDPR, so making sure that if you're using a custom GPT, you're conscious of your settings. For example, um, when we were looking at the ethics and we were looking at the vulnerabilities of custom GPTs, and the way that someone externally could come and ask the custom GPT to provide them with all the materials that was used to build that GPT. Um, it was recommended in the scholarship that what you should do is instruct your custom GPT not to hand over any documents that might be deemed by the institution to be under copyright or to be confidential. We found with Copilot, when I tried to instruct the bot that it couldn't give over my documentations for setting it up, it would not allow me to do that. It told me that I was asking it to do something that in its instructions was prohibited. Now, this could be in part because it's already within a closed system. There's also been a lot of debates around custom GPTs, that people could be using them and they don't know what documents it's pulling from, and it could make them quite vulnerable, particularly in medical circumstances. So there is a legitimate reason that people might want to actually ask what it's using, um, for to ensure it's essentially its viability and reliability. But if you are using it and you do think you're going to be using materials that, for whatever reason, absolutely cannot be made public, it's something that you should definitely check to see how the software that you're using handles those things. I It's also important to think about ethical boundaries and what the bot may or may not say inadvertently, and ensuring that any staff who might be using outputs checks them to make sure that they've had final oversight, so that something that shouldn't be in there is caught. Don't overload the bot. That's what I learned. You overload the bot and the bot stops working effectively, and every input you put in, you'll get a totally different output. Even if you put the same thing in twice, it seems to get quite overloaded if you have too many constraints. But I did find having clear requirements so that it knew the boundaries of what you wanted it to work in, and working off a requirement system seemed to be effective, at least for me. And it has been suggested in some of the scholarship that having clear requirements is a good thing. Consider the role, functions, and limitations of the tool and plan for that. So don't go in thinking that it's going to give you your perfect result. Think about, when it doesn't give you that perfect result, what's the value and where does that value lie? But make sure that your end user understands that. I think that one of the biggest mistakes I made is I went to staff and said, we're trying to develop this bot. We think it's going to give you a learning, a use statement. It's going to take what you have and put it out, and it's going to give you something that's workable. And for them, that read as, you're going to give me a final statement that's perfect to my discipline and my understanding of the module and my expectations of the module. And when it didn't deliver those things, the immediate response was to completely dismiss it. It didn't do what I thought. And I think if we had to come in and said, we're developing a bot. It's You're going to put in your content and it's going to get it about 80% there, but it's going to give you the space that you can tweak in what you like or you don't like. It's going to give you a really nice frame, and it's going to help you to think through where your bottom lines are. I think the response would have been different, and we would have had different conversations. So, really, I think understanding what the limitations of your tool are and its potential, and making sure those are the expectations of the end user during the development phase and after the development phase. And here are some of the references from the scholarship in case you're interested. Um, May et al. Does a really great overview of how they try to undertake requirement training for custom GPTs. So that I would recommend having a look, because I think that might be a upcoming space that we might see more attention around. Um, but also looking at, if you're worried around ethics and you're worried around kind of how people might access or get too much information out of your bot, it is definitely worth looking at today's et al. And their development of the custom GPT and KBAR. They have a really nice overview of looking at the pros and cons of custom GPTs, where they work, where they don't work, where the risks are. So yeah. Anyways, that's what we've done. But I thought I'd leave a little bit of time in case people had any questions, or they wanted to give us any feedback about their thought on it. We are still in really the development phase of trying to get it to work. We're expanding it out to more and more staff to get more and more opinions. So I'd love to hear what people in Liverpool have to think about it. I'll stop sharing now.
Thanks, Catherine. That was a really insightful sort of talk there, and it's good to see how the project sort of rolled over further or developed further from what you've when you met with me and Rob. And yeah, I've got a few questions, but I'll let the others come in first. If you do want to ask a question, feel free to use the chat, or if you hover over the main presenter on the screen, if you click react and there's a raise hand, and you should be able to unmute. The question I was going to ask Catherine is, when you rolled them out to staff, that initial testing, what setting did you do that in? Did you do like a workshop? Was it during like a module review, or did you do it all online? Be interesting to know how you rolled it out.
Well, I suppose those options would have all been really well, and I think probably better for shaping how people understood the bot. But initially it was during the summer period, and our crew tends to disappear into their research mindset and research focus. So instead, what I did is I sent out emails to heads of departments and said, we're looking to do this bot. Would anyone in your department be willing to send me their materials? I'll put it in and I'll send you back the output, and you guys can have a discussion. And so that's what we did. And it was quite a nice way to do it, in terms of it. I think it gave people more space to read through and really critically reflect. Some people came back really positive and said, "That's great. Can we have it for September?" But by and large, I had people come back and write me huge essays. Um, and that was insightful too, because it gave me a real sense of where people's headspaces were. And I got to hear a lot of individual voices that I mightn't have actually heard in the workshop. So I did approach it in that way. Um, Once I have more heads of department, I'm working my way through them. We actually have quite a few, despite being a small college. I am going to then, once we've fine tuned it a little bit more, open it out to the college, and then we'll do a workshop where people can come in and put in their outputs, and we can come around and talk to them and say, what do you think? We're also going to be putting the bot up on our microsite so that they can go and look and try it. But we're not making any of it compulsory. They don't have to do it, but just to get people thinking about it initially.
Brilliant. Thanks, Catherine. Tunde, you've got your hand up. Do you want to unmute?
Yeah, thank you, Katherine. Nice to see you. And I definitely use your tip about the boundering the GPT for. Thank you. My question was around accessibility. You mentioned some considerations, but could you just explain what aspect of accessibility you were dealing with at that point? Just, yeah, that would be
Yeah.
helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. So, when we were putting it through, we were looking to see, for example, would it produce it in a font that was good for someone with dyslexia, or on the table they used color coding, which a lot of staff said they really liked, but it was red-green color coding, which isn't great for people with color blindness. So we were trying to see if we could put in some requirements around font, but we couldn't. Then we tried to see if we could get it to change for its check boxes and its X's to get it to change the colors. Couldn't get it to do that. We looked to see when I typed in to see what did it know around accessibility. It actually knew quite a bit, and it could tell me different changes I could make on my end to make it more accessible. But it would mean that I'd have to, when I after I downloaded it, I'd have to go back and do a bunch of formatting. And what we had hoped was that we wouldn't have to do that formatting. There's other things that we're kind of conscious of as well, is that, if you have any type of visual impairment and you're having to go and copy and paste across into the different documents and then get an output from that, it it didn't have that kind of, the reader interface. Um, so those were issues, but I know from other talks we were kind of conscious of things, for example, with students with autism, where if they don't get a description that's really, really precise around what they can or cannot do, the vagueness and things can be very difficult for them to interpret and can be overwhelming. So, for example, in initial outputs, it would say things like you can't use you can use generative AI for improving your grammar and your writing, and but to what line? So can it rewrite the whole thing for you, or is it about correcting spelling mistakes, or is it about syntax? What specifically? um, so it wasn't really able to do that. We did put in guidelines in our initial bot to say, you have to put this in specifically. But as soon as we had too much constriction, it didn't function as well. So then you had to strip those out, and you'd have to kind of notify staff that if you're putting in those types of things, they need to be that small bit more detailed. So those were some of the difficulties that we were trying to work our heads around. I don't know if that's helpful.
Yeah, very. Thank you. That's really useful for all those considerations. Thank you.
Yeah.
There's a question in the chat, Catherine, from
Mm,
Fatima, just
yeah.
saying, why did you choose Copilot when designing the chatbot? Does it have specific advantages over the other AI tools?
Uh, Largely, no, it doesn't have advantages. It gave me huge headaches. Um, Copilot is way more clunky compared to, ChatGPT or Gemini. It cannot perform on the same level. So it could be really, really frustrating. But we came up against two things. One, for ICT, we had to have something that was closed within our system for data protection reasons, and essentially Copilot was on our approved list of technologies. So that was really the biggest consideration. The second thing for us was that a lot of the generative AIs, they work on a credit card system, but in our Irish institutions, because we're state run, we have to do everything on a PO system. And as soon as we were going to any of the different AI companies to say we'd like to get an institutional license, can we do it on a PO system? They vanished. They would not speak to us. And we couldn't put it on a credit card. So it meant that suddenly we were really limited in our choices. Um, so that was the reason for why we went with it. But in terms of functionality, it's far more clunky. It gives you the benefits of you know, at the face of it, that you have more institutional security for your data. Even the use of this, the bot will be put into a SharePoint, so only people internal to Mary I will be able to use and access it. So it's kind of closing it down to the open. Now this project is publicly funded, and so it has to be made publicly available. But instead, what we're doing is we're taking the instructions and the guidance that we've given to the bot, and we're making that publicly available, so that if somebody wants to put it into their own systems, that they can do that. But yeah, that was the reason. So
Thanks for sharing that. Any other questions from anyone else at all? Nothing else has come through the chat. No? All right, if not, then just a big thank you again, Katherine, for sharing that project and sharing your time about it. Are you happy to be contacted by people if they've got any questions after this?
absolutely. And if you have any criticisms as well, do send them through, because we are still working it out, and you might look at it and say, you've not thought of this. How did you miss that? So definitely, if you have any questions come through, if you have anything where you think you could have been doing that better, let us know. Any feedback is much appreciated.
Thanks, Katherine. We'll post the slides if we can get them off you as well.
Yeah.
I'll put them on the Padlet board, so I'll post that there. And thank you everyone for attending this morning. Hopefully you found that useful as well. We'll hopefully see you at some other sessions. I've just posted the Padlet board again, just if you want to see the schedule and the other sessions this week. And yeah, thanks, Katherine, again. Hopefully we'll catch up soon.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you guys so much for having me.
I will stop the recording there and I'll just stick around in case anyone does want to ask any questions.